first thing is we talk about what type of rigs. There are a lot of different types of rigs, right? So you guys went around for the 547, but the old 12 meters or something. Those straight spreader rigs are old style. Usually have runners and check stays and a whole bunch of stuff with straight spreader rigs. You have a lot of spreaders. And those are a completely kind of different animal than what we usually sail, which is what? What do our spreaders do? But back spreader rigs do a lot of things. They help prevent your rig from twisting off the reeds. They provide you with a little backstay force, so you don't need you don't need to have runners on all the time to have the rig stay up. It's really nice. But they do complicate your rig tune a little bit because it makes everything do more than one thing. So we'll go to that. We also have what type of rig do we sail with generally? Modern rigs. Bermuda rig or a marconi rig or a fractional rig, right? What does that mean?
The forestay doesn't go to the top.
The forestay doesn't go all the way to the top.
Which means you don't have a masthead forestay. Some cruiser boats have masthead forestays, right? They go all the way to the top of the rig. We have 7/8 rigs or usually something like that. So we have a forestay that's like here, right? And then we have a backstay, right? That's all the way to the top.
Yeah.
Right, and then we've got our spreaders, which are generally like
there,
here-ish, and then like here-ish, right? That's what back spreaders. This is huge, having a fractional rig. Anybody know why a fractional rig makes such a huge difference?
You can depower your mainsail by bending the top of the mast plate.
Yes. It means that dynamically and statically, your rig depowering mechanisms work way better. There's this, and you probably draw a rig from behind so that we can talk about what that also does. So there's your rig from behind. Got your upper spreaders, got your lower spreaders, and you've got your deck, right? So you've got your cap shrouds come out of the forestay, right? They come out of the hounds. Everybody know that that's what the hounds are called? The hounds are where your forestay and cap shrouds connect to the mast. They're usually in the same spot. That's where your jib halyard is too, generally. So that's how most of our rigs look. We call these V's or caps. These are D2s. These are D1s. You can have D1s, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You can also have diamonds on the top of the rig on some boats. We generally don't. You can have continuous rigging where your D2s come down to the deck. That's what Ouija has. You guys sail on Ouija, you have 3 wires down here. I'm sticking with kind of a FAR 40 outline because that's what we're doing over here. So, when you pull on your backstay, let's say a puff is coming on and you crank on backstay, what does it do?
Which is the lower part of the mast forward and the tip of the mast back.
Yeah, so you pull down on the backstay, right? It's gonna pull back on the top of the rig, which is gonna force the middle of the mast forward, right? It's also gonna tighten the forestay, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Also, if you act as it's gonna bend, and you're gonna get a nice, hopefully, if you're tuned right, you're gonna get a nice bend like this, right? With backstay on. Right, that's gonna compress the mast, which is gonna wanna bend it. By pulling the tip back, you make that bend go forward. The forestay will tighten up, and the middle of your mast will go forward, right? When you have your mainsail, what does that do to your mainsail, right?
Breaks
But now what does it do to your mainsail shape?
flat powers.
flattens it,
Flat main,
opens the back.
correct. Opens leach. What does it do to your jib?
Tightens the luff and
Tightens the luff, that's right, and that's the forestay, right? So your forestay's not sagging. What else does it do to your shape?
Flat.
forward.
Draft forward. What does it do to your main shape?
Down.
Draft back. Alright, yeah, so the curve takes out your luff curve of your main, that flattens your main out, right? Consequently, your leach will also open up and your draft will move back on your main. Your forestay tightens up, that moves your draft on your jib forward, and it tightens up your sag, all of which depowers the jib, right? Moving the open leach and flattening the main depowers the main. Draft back actually powers it up. That's why we have to put Cunningham on when we put backstay on, right? That's the only not side effect of backstay, is your draft moves back on your main. So, all of these things, the main thing it does is bend the mast, right? And then all of the side effects of the backstay are good things when it's windy, when it's puff, right? Jib depowers, main depowers, all good things just with a backstay, right? If you had a masthead rigged jib, not much of that would happen, right? You can't quite get the same effect. Part of the problem is too, even if you're not touching the backstay, you have a mainsail up here, right? The mainsail goes to the top of the rig. When a puff hits the mainsail, let's say you don't do any backstay, it's as if you just put backstay on. You get more leech tension on your main because you have more breeze in it. That means the tip's going to bend back. That means the forestay is going to depower. That means the main's going to depower automatically in a puff. When you have a masthead rig and you get hit by a puff, the jib loads up, the main loads up, they balance each other. The jib sags more, the jib gets more powerful, the main does not depower because the mast doesn't bend, and your boat gets more powered up, which is what you don't want in a puff, right? That's why cruising boats can be very, very twitchy in puffs, because they don't dynamically respond to puffs in a positive way like a sloop rig does. Make sense?
I have a question.
Yes.
Then why would cruising boats have a masthead rig?
You get a bigger general,
Okay.
because you get a big old cruising general.
And
That's pretty much it.
It doesn't add stability or anything like that?
No, just allows you to get a bigger jib.
And then you can sail without a main.
And then you can sail without a spinnaker downwind because you have this massive general, right? Because they don't. Some cruising boats do come like this. When the cruiser racers are a little more racy, they'll come with this because it's a more stable thing to sail in when you're really racing. So we also have a boom down here, right? So I've talked about a Cunningham, right? And we'll talk about the other control, which is this one right here, right? The Vang. Those three kind of go together: backstay, Cunningham, and Vang. When you put backstay on, because the draft on your main moves back. Everyone knows what the draft talks about, right? Your sail shape looks like this, right? The mast is here. If you drew a dotted line from the front of the sail to the back end of the sail, the actual leech, the area of deepest draft, right? Deepest camber, sorry, is what we call the draft. That placement of deepest camber, right here, this is the deepest depth. Fore and aft. On a main, you want it to be at about 50%. On a jib, you want it to be, maybe not that aggressively, sorry. On the jib,
It's
you want
like
it to be
25, 30.
yeah, like 25, 30, 10, something like that, 25 to 35, maybe even 15 to 35, depending on the performance of the boat. You go way further forward. So as you put backstay on, this draft moves back. Cunningham, when you pull it on, moves the draft forward again, right? Cunningham is not a wrinkle removal device. That's not what it does. That's a side effect of what it does visually, but that's not what you're doing with the Cunningham. So you got to get rid of that idea if you have that idea. People say, "Oh, there's wrinkles. We should put some Cunningham and get rid of them." No. Ooh, we have wrinkles. Where's our draft position? Draft position's pretty far back. Then maybe we put Cunningham's only a draft moving device. That's it. Doesn't get rid of wrinkles. If you have massive wrinkles in your main, but your draft is in the perfect spot, I wouldn't put any Cunningham on. Right? So you usually only use Cunningham when you're overpowered and you're putting backstay on. And then you pull your Cunningham to leave your draft in that maybe 40 to 50% range. Which would be, if this was your main, you're talking about like right here-ish. In lighter air, you go further back. In heavier air, you go further forward. You never want to pull all your wrinkles out and have your max draft be right up forward next to the mast. That's a really bad, slow look for a main. So Cunningham goes on when the backstay goes on, and then your Vang also goes on when the backstay goes on, generally because the Vang shoves the boom into the lower part of the mast, right? And it helps bend the bottom of the mast. The backstay generally only bends the top half or so. The Vang will bend the bottom quarter. So the Vang's just helping get a little more pre-bend in the bottom to help flatten the main out. It also helps close your leech up, which is open because you're putting backstay on, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was another point to that. No, I think that might be it.
Cunningham moves draft forward.
Moves draft forward. Vang just closes the leech up and pre-bends the bottom of the mast. So every control's got multiple effects, and there's reasons why you use them in light air, medium air, and all that. So you gotta know that if you put a lot of Vang on, you're also bending the bottom of the mast. Your outhaul is basically a lower third of the main control. That's the only thing it affects is the lower third of the main, the depth. So your backstay is gonna flatten the top 2/3 of the main. Your backstay is not going to affect the bottom of the main much. Your Vang is going to affect it a little bit, the depth, but your outhaul is going to be your main depth control in the bottom. And so if you put backstay on, and you've put Cunningham on, and you've got all your Vang on, your outhaul should be boned too. A secondary reason to have your outhaul boned in heavy air is because usually you're trimming your jib really, really tight, and you want to have a really tight slot between the jib and the main. Too much outhaul closes that slot off on the bottom. So you put the outhaul tight so you have a clean slot. And because you don't need any extra power. At some point you start going with less drag, less lift, less power, because you have plenty. And then less drag becomes the higher value rather than more power. So you are to start reducing drag instead of increasing power. They do that with the AC-45, all the AC boats now. It's more about reducing drag than it is about increasing power. They don't need any more, they've got plenty. What other controls do we have to play with here? Anyone think of any besides alcohol,
Halyards.
Cunningham? Halyard tension. Halyard tension on the main is very similar to Cunningham. All it does is move your draft forward or back, right? So I usually like to have my halyard tension set so downwind looks perfect or slightly tight, just slightly.
I'm sorry, say it again.
I set my main halyard tension so that when I'm going downwind, my main looks really good. It means that upwind you have to put on a crap load of Cunningham. Because it's probably way too loose for upwind. But I'd rather have Cunningham upwind. Cunningham's really easy to pop on and off. Gives you something to ease on the downwind. People who crank the main tight so it looks perfect upwind, then have to ease halyard on the downwind to get the main to look good. Which, if you're sailing without spinnakers on a match 40, that's fine because your pit person has nothing to do. Might as well ease the main halyard and trim it back up. But for that extra inch and a half you're going to get on halyard, I'd rather just put Cunningham on. Because it's easier to get on and off, and it's a control that everyone knows. So it's like, for me, yeah, the main, if you don't ease halyard, or if you have it too tight on the downwind, it looks terrible. The draft, it looks like you have a knuckle up forward and then this thing going in the back. It looks terrible. You got this wrinkle at the very front of the sail. You can, like, a wrinkle, full wrinkle. If you're sailing in heavy air and then you go downwind. So I usually put more Cunningham on than halyard. Jib halyard moves the draft fore and aft as well. Doesn't affect sag. Forestay sag and halyard. Forestay sag does affect the draft position on the sail. Halyard also affects the draft position, so they're kind of mixed a bit. You have to be careful because even slight changes in your halyard tension and your sag make huge changes on what your leech shape looks like on the jib. Right? So if you think you have trim marks perfect, and then you go add 2 more inches of halyard, your trim mark probably moved 2 inches or more. What does it do? Halyard on means you're more trimmed in relatively. You ease the halyard, you ease off the leech. Does that make sense? Ease halyard, you ease the leech. Trim halyard, you trim the leech, basically. So if you've added halyard, you probably have to go ease your sheet. If that makes sense. I believe that's how it goes. But it's way more than you think. So if you ever ask for more halyard on the jib, better go recheck your trim settings. The other thing is Mainsheet, right, versus Traveler. Those are all pretty simple things, but your Mainsheet acts as a backstay upwind, right? By trimming on the main, you're tightening the leech of the main. You're actually bending the mast. So on boats without backstays, like the Ultimate 20s in Detroit, you crank on Mainsheet, it gets really tight, and you reach in and you grab 2 more feet of Mainsheet, you've just flattened your main out all the way. You do it on the Class 40 a lot. If you trim in really hard on the Class 40 on the Mainsheet, because you're on that winch and you've got a nice purchase on it, you can flatten the main out, and then your backstay is basically not doing anything at that point because you're all Mainsheet backstay. So it kind of doubles up as a backstay sometimes. You got to be careful of that over trimming, because you'll see that a little bit of ease sometimes won't actually ease the main; it will just deepen the main. And what you're doing is letting the mast go straight again when you do that. When you pull backstay on, the leech opens. It usually means you have to pull Mainsheet on, right? Everyone got that? Backstay on, Mainsheet on, to keep your leech profile the same. You're going to flatten the main. Leech is going to open. You're going to trim your main on. That's going to close your leech. Now you just have a flatter main, which is usually all you want when you put backstay on. Is a tighter forestay and a flatter main, not a more open main. Initially, when you pull backstay on, it's in a puff. That helps you respond nicely to the puff to have an open leech. But then you want to trim the main sheet on if it stays on to keep your shape the same. Does that make sense? Your goal is always to do little changes and keep your perfect shape. If you have your shape perfect and a puff hits, you just want a flatter perfect shape. You usually don't need more twist unless it all got wavier or something.
Is there any difference between a backstay like on a 440 and a boat with runners, just because of the angle?
It depends on where the runners are. If they're split backstays, like Ouija has, which they go all the way up to the top of the rig, they're the same thing as this. They're just split so you can put a fat head main on it.
Okay.
If they're runners generally go lower. And that's more of a forestay tightening device and than a bending. They usually have a top, like the 547 had a top mast backstay, and runners. And that also had check stays, but it has a straight spreader rig, which is going to react very
So
differently.
are check stays mainly straight spreaders?
Yeah, you'll only see check stays usually on straight spreader rigs. You'll see
Couple of those.
the Class 40 has top mast split backstays, and it also has.
And that's to control the.
It also has check stays. Yeah, it's to control the bouncing of the middle of the rig and
Okay.
moves.
So we
Especially
need to play
especially
with
when
it
you
a
have the trinket up. On the Class 40 you have another halyard here, and you put the trink on the inner halyard, and that one doesn't have deflectors. On the Class 40 you've got deflectors that'll pull the backstay into the forestay, so that your backstay load will support the forestay load, the solent when you're reaching on the solent. And then you've got check stays that run down to where the trinket halyard comes out to help support the trinket. It's not really to affect too much mast bend. The halyard on the backstay on the Class 40 barely bends the mast. If you look at your mast going up when you crank on a crap load of halyard,
It's trying
it
to show
doesn't
the
bend
negatives
all
to
that
it.
much. That mast is pretty stiff. But yeah.
On the backstay bends mast tightens the forestay,
Tightens the forestay.
even though the middle of the mast bends forward, it's.
It's where this is versus the middle of the mast, right?
Yep.
And that's where we come into tuning, right? So that's what the control does. It'll try to bend the mast. How much the mast bends and how much your forestay tightens comes down to what your tuning on your rigging is, right? So that's where then now we're talking about what the D1s, D2s, and the caps do to all that, right? Your cap shrouds basically just keep the rig up. They don't do much else. They also will pre-bend the mast. As in with no wind, no sails up, if you have your cap shrouds super, super tight, you're compressing the mast will want to bend some, right? If you didn't have D1s or D2s at all, right, the mast would just bend a ton. There's nothing keeping it from bending. Because we have swept back spreaders, right, there's your cap shrouds. Because you have swept back spreaders, your D2s and your D1s actually go back from the mast, which means their tension helps prevent the mast from bending, right? That's what they're doing, because they're coming back from a certain point in the mast. The tension on those rods prevent the mast from bending forward. Does that make sense, everyone? Okay? The more tension, the less the mast is going to bend. The less tension, the less it's going to bend. Does that make sense? But if you look at it fore and aft, they also prevent the mast from bending sideways. So they do dual purpose. And this is where everything gets fun. You want the mast to be straight up and down in your medium heavy air. You want the mast to be perfectly in column with the main up. The tip is more or less unsupported by shrouds. The tip's always going to fall off a little to leeward in heavy air. A little bit. You can't do anything about that. There's nothing up there holding it up, so that's what's going to happen. But the D1s and the D2s are going to keep your spreaders from going left or right, right? They don't affect any other spot but the point they're attached to the mast, right? In light air, you want kind of a nice even sag with maybe a little tip to windward, right? And that's why we lighten everything up in light air. But not only are they preventing side-to-side bend, but they're preventing fore and aft bend, which means that if you don't have any D1, D2 tension, when you pull on backstay, the mast is going to bend a crap load, and your forestay is not going to tighten, because the mast is just going to bend around there. It's never going to pull back on the forestay. Does that make sense? All of your backstay tension goes into bending the mast and not tightening the forestay. And what you'll see when you're set up with too loose of a D1s and D2s is you'll crank on backstay and your main will overbend. You'll get overbend wrinkles, right? That are diagonal streaks, wrinkles in the main. Those are overbend wrinkles. And your jib and your forestay will still be sagging off quite a bit. You'll be like, why do I have too powerful of a jib and a completely too flat main? It means you don't have enough D1 and D2 tension. Because that D1 and D2 tension will prevent the bending of the mast and transfer more of that load to the forestay.
Can
Does
that
that
also
make sense?
just mean simply overloading backstay?
It means you're going to have too much backstay
Diagonal
for your
wrinkles.
tuning, yes. It means you have too
For
much
your
back.
tuning? But like if you're tuned right,
If you're tuned
you
right
bake in backstay.
and you put on all the backstay because you feel like you still need it, your tuning is wrong.
Oh, okay.
You should
Got
go
it.
up on your tuning, right? It means that there's something wrong. If your main's overbent and your forestay is still too powerful, right? Now, if you pull on backstay and your main doesn't get flat enough and your forestay gets really, really tight, that means you've got too much D1, D2 tension. You can't depower your main, but you're depowering your jib a lot,
Okay.
right? And that probably means you need to loosen your tension a little bit so you get more mast bend. That's how you then need to match your tuning to your sails and your rig, and this is where you start matching everything really well. So you've got three things to check really. Is your mast straight up and down when you're trimmed up going upwind? Is your main depth matching your forestay sag and your jib depth? And if it all matches well in the puffs and out of the puffs, then your tuning is probably correct. You know if your main's too flat, overbent, and your jib's too powerful, you need to go up on your D1, D2 tension. If your main's not flat enough, and you're putting on backstay and your jib looks really good, it means you probably have too much D1, D2. But you also want it to be straight up and down. So that's what you can't forget. You always got to go back and check straight up and down and then depths.
Do the D1, D2 tensions match? All the time?
No.
Okay.
We usually don't put a loose gauge on them. When you go out and tune these on the dock, you're going to look up the mast with no sails up, and you're going to make the mast straight. But then you have to go sailing with your sails up, and then look up the mast and make it straight. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So you're never going to measure that tension, and the relative tensions of them are different. When you go and move up a step of tuning, because there's different loads here and here on the main, there's different sail areas that they're controlling. You generally might go up a turn here and a half a turn here. You're not just going to automatically go up a turn everywhere.
Okay.
And then you might do like 2 turns on the caps and 1 turn on these and a half turn on the D2s. Or the first step on a 540 is like 2 turns on the cap, 1 turn on the D1, no turns on the D2. And then if you move up another step to 14 knots of breeze, you'll do another 2 turns, another 1 turn, and then a half a turn, kind of thing, you know.
So with the Ouija having the D2, you said the D2 goes to the deck.
Goes to the deck, yeah.
So is that just easier access, or what else?
It's just a different. It means each one's got its own wire. Right now, this D2 goes to a turnbuckle on the cap shrouds to a tip cup on the 540, and you have to adjust it up here, and then it all combines into one single rod that goes down here. It's just a different style. You'll have 3 turnbuckles at the deck instead of 2. It's more windage. It's a little bit more weight. Probably just more windage. It means you have to go up the rig to tune it. It saves you a little windage, so more racy boats tend to do it up here. But you have a turnbuckle up there. I don't know if it's more a little loft. I don't know. Doesn't make too much sense. All right, so tuning the rig once the rig's in the boat is where we are now. And usually when you tune the rig with the weight in the boat, you don't look at this picture at all, like sideways. You're only looking fore and aft on it. You put the rig in the boat, everything's loose, everything's floppy, you have no idea what's going on. First thing you do is you measure your forestay length. Usually boats have the 540s have a forestay length. They've got a mark on the mast, right where the gooseneck is, right? You measure down from there a meter, you swing a halyard, you mark that, you swing that halyard out here, you mark the forestay, and you measure from there down to the pin. The reason why you move down, mark it, swing, mark, and measure is because if you swung the gooseneck mark, it would be so high, you wouldn't be able to get your hands up there to take measure on it. It'd be like 10, 12 feet high. So by moving down, making another mark, and swinging a halyard from there to the forestay, this becomes a reasonable measurement. It's like 5 feet 11 inches. And if you measure that measurement and you adjust the forestay to the forestay's the right length, that adjusts your rig, right? The forestay's adjusting your rig. Once you have that done, we hand tight up the shrouds and we bring the mast jack pressure up to like 2,500 pounds, 2,400 pounds. That's a nominal little bit of pressure. You don't want to be measuring side to side on the rig with no pressure on the shrouds. Does that make sense? So you go down below and you jack up the mast, and right when the shims underneath the mast start moving, that's your jack off pressure. And then you open the jack really slowly and you drop the mast back down on those shims, and right when they stop moving, that's your jack on pressure. You average the 2 numbers, do it a couple times, and that's your pressure. That's your jack pressure for that setting. So you bring the jack pressure to some nominal shroud tension. If I do the match 40s, I tension up the shrouds pretty tight first, like 50 on the loose gauge, 45. I take them to 55 in the end. I go to 50 on the loose gauge on the shrouds. And once it's on 50, then I can measure side to side.
And this is all before you're looking at where the
I'm not even looking at them. I'm not even looking if it's straight or something.
So like when we were doing
Forestay
Ouija-
first, a little bit of shroud tension all the way up. Now you can look at your turnbuckles and make sure they're pretty close to being straight, right? You can.
Because if they're way off, you've got something wrong with your
Yeah. You don't want to have one turbuckle all the way down, one turbuckle all the way off.
Does that mean
Because you
one's
know you're going to
bent
have to
or-
be way off to one side then.
Yeah, like if there's a huge difference, does that mean something's fucked up with the
It might mean you
shroud?
have different size shrouds, but it
Okay.
might mean that your mast is not
Yeah.
straight, it's tilted off to one side. So make it as close as you can, get it up to a nominal tension, and then you grab some halyard that's attached near the hounds and center line if you can. Right? So on a FAR 40, not a frac halyard because they exit off center, but a jib halyard works really well. Usually a jib halyard is your good thing. The jib halyard exits right underneath the forestay and about 6 to 8 inches underneath the hounds. So you take your jib halyard and you put equal tension on it and you measure to somewhere on the deck, right on the chain plate. Screw on the chain plate, the bottom of the turnbuckle bolt, something that doesn't move when you adjust it, right? It's got to be something fixed to the boat, not above the turnbuckle. Usually I use a screw or part of the chain plate. I usually don't use the side of the boat because sometimes those are a little off, right? If it's the first time you get a boat, before I measure side to side at all, the first thing I'll do is I'll measure to see if the mast is centered on the boat, right? Because sometimes the hole they cut in the middle of the deck is not centered. And right, we got the stuff around the mast inside the boat that's called Spartite, right? You cast that by taping up the bottom and you pour it in. When you first do that, since our boats have already been done, when you first do that, you're going to measure to the sides of the boat, to the chain plates, and make sure the mast is centered. And if not, you're going to move it till it's centered, and then cast your Spartite so it looks like that. That's why sometimes when you look at Spartite, it's not symmetric. It's because they're accounting for the fact that the hole cut in the boat's not centered. Sometimes a half an inch, sometimes an inch off. Once you do that, though, then you take your halyard, your jib halyard, you measure down to your chain plates for your cap shrouds. You're taking your jib halyard, which is from up here, and you're measuring down to here. And what you want to do generally is put the same amount of weight on it. Sometimes you can hang a bucket of tools off the side of the boat. Sometimes you can hang a tool bag. Sometimes you can have someone sitting in a halyard, near the water line. And then you have to run it from one side all the way around the topping lift, if you have it, to the other side, and you measure the other side. And what you're seeing is that if the measurement's the exact same. If it's off, you want to adjust turnbuckles to bring it back to center, right? So if the mast was measured to be a little, you measured it with the line here, and then you came down here and your line was down below the turnbuckle, you'd be like, wow, okay, the rig's off to the right? And the important point is that the tip is not off to the right, because the tip's unsupported, you can't move that. That just is what it is, right? But the hounds are off to the right. It's a subtle difference. People like to say, oh yeah, it looks like the tip's off to the left. Sometimes it is, but that's a D problem, not a cap shroud problem. Your cap shrouds do not move the tip of the rig. They move the hounds, right? They move where they're connected to. They can't do anything else. Does that make sense? Give me an honest, because people always say that. Whenever you're tuning a rig, oh yeah, tip's off to the hounds. That's what the measurements are. So in this case, if you were rigged to the right, hounds to the right, you would tighten the port turnbuckle and you'd loosen the starboard turnbuckle, right? And by tightening one and loosening the other, you keep your tension the same. That's the other thing that people get it wrong all the time. They say, ooh, loose gauge, this one says it's 10. This one says it's 8. That means we should tighten this one so that it gets to 10. Not really. It's a movable system. If you tighten one side, the other side's going to tighten as well, right? If I pull on the left side, it's going to pull the right side tighter as well. If I loosen one side, the other side's going to loosen up too. They always equalize. The only reason you get differences are little tweaks in it, or it hasn't settled in, and stuff like that. So you will get small differences in loose tension, but generally you do never try to equalize tension. Because if you saw this, 10 here and 8 here, and you said, okay, I'm going to put on 2 turns over here, what are you doing? You're moving the rig to the right. You're tightening that turnbuckle, that rig's moving right. You just made your rig non-centered. That's what goes wrong when people think that they should be equalized tension. Because they're connected to the same spot and the rig moves, there's bendy, it's going to move, it'll equalize its tensions. You don't worry about tensions being equal side to side. You worry about straightness and then overall tension. So I usually average my side to side tensions. I'll measure one, I'll measure the other, and I'll go, okay, we're at 9 on the cap shrouds right now. Even though that said 10, that said 8, we're at 9. I just averaged the 2. So, you've changed your turnbuckles around, you've adjusted, you've measured, you've adjusted, you've measured, you've done that 10 times, and you're pretty damn certain that it's exactly hounds straight over the center of the boat, same measurement side to side. You're like, all right, cool, we're good. At that point, you only add and subtract equally side to side. I mean, you only add a turn on each side, or you subtract a turn on each side. Now you never do a difference side to side. They're always the same. So now you're at your 2,400 PSI on the jack, and you go, okay, FAR 40 base should be 3,600. Let's crank it up to 3,600. Sorry, if I'm thinking about the tuning guide right, you don't do that yet. You do the D2s first. Otherwise, you bend your mast to shipload. You can't get your D2s on. So when you're at 2,400, and you've got yourself centered in the boat, the hounds centered in the boat, you move down to your D1s, your D2s, and your D1s, and on the FAR 40s, you just go hand tight. Plus, I think 4 turns and 6 turns or something like that, they tell you in the tuning guide. But you nominally snug them up. You get them pretty snug and pretty equal side to side. Once you've got them snug, then you bring your jack pressure up to 3,600. And to do that, you add turns on your caps, and you'd add 6 turns on each, 4 turns on each, 2 turns on each. You wouldn't go 3 turns on one, 2 turns on the other, because then you're moving your tip, right? That's very important. So you bring on your cap shroud pressure, your caps turnbuckles, and then you go down below and you do your jack, and then you take it down and you average your numbers. Okay, we're only at 3,000 psi. 4 more turns on both caps. Jack it up, check it. Ah, we're at 36. We're good, right? Once you're there, then you come up on deck and you look at whether the rig is noodly or not, right? That's what it is. I also tend to take a quick glance from the side and see how much prebend there is, because that'll roughly tell you if you're used to how they should look, whether you have enough D's on or not. If you put 3,600 psi on the jack and your mast looks like this much bend, and you go, wow, that's way too much for base, which is like 10 knots of breeze. Mast should not look like that. That you know you should have to add turns on your D1s and D2s right away, just because that's too much prebend with no sails up. Does that make sense? If you go out and look at the FAR 40 on the dock, or the blue, once we have it tuned, get a look for what it normally looks like when there's no rig tension, there's no sails up, and there's base tuning, and you'll get an idea of how much prebend it has. It's not a lot, and sometimes it'll scare you, and that means that you just didn't put enough of these on.
How tight do you do D1s and D2s for starters?
They tell you they say hand tight,
Okay.
whatever that means, plus 4 turns or 6 turns, right? And then I check if it looks right. If it doesn't look right, I just put a few more on until it looks more correct. So now you've got your rig centered, you've got your pressure correct, your jack pressure correct, and now you're gonna have to go up and adjust your D2s. Here's the funny thing: as you tighten your D2s, what does that do to your jack pressure and your D1s? It increases your jack pressure, right? So you're gonna have to go back and decrease your shrouds. So I think you bring it up to like 3,200, maybe 3,000, not all the way up, because you're gonna add turns on these to keep your jack pressure the same. Otherwise, if your jack pressure is perfect and your mast bend is perfect, but your mast just isn't straight this way, you would just take off one, add one. That way your jack pressure stays the same. Does that make sense? So now you look up the mast and you see a bend like this and a bend like this, and the tip's going off that way, right? Does that make sense? How it would do that? Yeah, that's all diagonals doing that, right? And so here's where you start using your touchy feelies. Like, does it feel like it's bent? If it feels like it's bent, it's probably bent. Sometimes it's very subtle. But your D1s only move the spreaders. They don't take a bend out right here. If you've got a bend between the boom, and it looks like here's where the fun part is, right? I don't know. Like drawing these quickly is hard. If it looks like there's a bend here, right? That bend you can't adjust with your right? If it's that and the tip's going off this way, right? So you've got a bend below that spreader. This spreader looks pretty good, and then the mast tip bends off to one side. So if you did something like this is kind of what it looks like. This is greatly exaggerated. That probably means, and then if you look at this and you go, wow, it looks like the spreaders are off to the left, right? So let's tighten up the starboard D1. And so you tighten that starboard D1, you loosen the port D1, and it gets worse. And you go, why is that? That's funky. It generally means your mast isn't straight in the boat. It means that this instead of needing to go to starboard, actually needs to go to port. This probably needs to go to port as well, and that'll bring them centered over the bottom of the rig.
If it looks like that, do not go sailing. It's freaking dangerous.
So sometimes when you start tightening up D1s and D2s, in which you think is the correct way to move, because that's the way the bend looks, and it gets worse, it means you generally need to go the other direction, and it probably means that your rig's not centered in the boat, and you need to remeasure that.
Should the bend be focused right around where the D1s connect? If that's what you're using to adjust, like
Yes.
not in between them?
Yes. You should have the center of the curve. You've got a curve here. It should be.
Okay.
You should have the center of this curve should be on here. If it's not, it generally indicates there's the rig's not centered. So you're gonna see a little bit of curve, and you're gonna say, okay, what's going on in this curve? These spreaders here need to move left, take that curve out, right? That's tighten the port, loosen the starboard. Equal turns. On the top one, you do the same thing. In this case, it wants to go right, correct? It's going to loosen the port D2, tighten the starboard D2, that's going to move it right. And you'll notice, if you draw a mast bend out, the D2s and the D1s are what cause the tip to go off to one side, right? If I pulled my mast port with the D2s, it's going to rotate around the hounds, which are locked in place because you're not adjusting them, right? And the tip's going to rotate around that and go off to starboard. If the tip's to starboard, your D2s most likely also need to go to starboard. Yeah.
Because it's a mast and it's all connected, do you want to start at the D1s to line up the bottom and then the D2s to line up the next?
Yeah, if you did your centered, you measured your cap shrouds first, and your mast is centered in the boat, and the hounds, in the mast partners in the bottom, this is fixed, and this is fixed. It doesn't matter which one you start on, really.
Okay.
Generally here I start on the bottom because it's the easiest, so you don't have to send someone up the rig. So I get the bottom close, I send someone up the rig, I tell them to do their work, and while they're working, I keep checking it and adjusting while they're doing it.
Even though the bottom of the mast is bent to the right, your spreaders are to the right, and your D2s are to the right.
If this does a bend like this,
Yeah.
sometimes your D2s can also be to the right, but not necessarily. Sometimes
the
it'll look
the
like.
bottom of your D2s.
Well, you don't have bottom D2s. You have where the D2s are attached.
Where they're attached to the spreaders.
Yeah. You mean right here? Here is
Yeah.
moved a bit to the. Yeah. It affects it a little bit, but it's the tension actually moving that double because the tension's on both sides. Moving that over is not really going to bend your mast much. It's not going to increase or decrease the relative tensions on those much. So I always do the bottom one first, just because it's the easiest. But it doesn't. I think you can go top. You can start at the top, go down, but then you have to go back and adjust up here again, and then you have to go down here and adjust again. So it's kind of. I do the bottom as close as I can, send someone up, and then I do both at the same time. After that. Yeah. So when you ask someone to look up the mast, you're looking at the back of the mast track right above the boom. You're looking up that mast track, and you want it to be stacked up on itself, directly vertical. And when you see bend, you're like, where is the belly at the spreader? You're looking right at the spreader to find out, is the mast bent there? And if it's bent there, which side is it bent to? And I use my hand a lot when I'm talking to people. Look up, or what do you see? Do you see this at the first spreader? And they go, yeah, okay, so we need to go to port, right? People love to look at the tip and say, well, the tip's off the starboard. And I go, that doesn't help me any. I'm not looking at that, right? You're looking at the spreaders. D1s, D2s, D3s, depending on the boat, move up from there. Cool. And that's basically the gist of it. Once you're there, you go back and check jack pressure again. If your jack pressure is perfect, you're done. If your jack pressure is 3,400 and you want it to be 36, you go, okay, put a turn on the caps. Did that work? Okay, check to make sure it's straight still. Great. It might mean your D1s and D2s are a little loose, but the D1s and D2s true tension happens when you go sailing. You go sailing, you look up the mast, see how it bends side to side. You tack. If it's bent the exact way side to side, you go, we're looking pretty good. Keep sailing, you go into a puff, you put a little backstay on, you look at your jib, your forestay, and your backstay, and you go, it all looks pretty balanced, feeling pretty good, everything matches side to side, you're done. Usually you're going to be adjusting the D2s and the D1s a lot as you tack side to side to make them look exactly the same side to side.
Do you usually get that like when you're dealing with your D1s and D2s, do you get that S curve because it's reacting to, like if it's off on the right for your D1s, is it going to go off to your left on the, but you know, that noodly shape instead of like one bow?
Not necessarily, no.
Okay.
I just drew it that way because that's the hardest one.
Alright.
That's the one way it's the hardest to see, to adjust, because you got to go one way on one and the other way on the other. But no, sometimes you'll get just a continuous little bend like that, and both of them need to go to the same side. Sometimes if you usually you don't touch the D2s as you take the rig apart. They're usually not touched. And sometimes you don't need to touch the D1, especially on boats that have jacks. You just jack the mast up, you take all the shims out, the boat drops down, you pull the pins on the shrouds, and you take it off. And so sometimes, like on far 40s, when they're not new rigging, which is what we're dealing with this year, you get really damn close to the proper tuning right away. And sometimes you just barely have to tweak to get a half turn here and a half turn there. Sometimes it's quite a bit off.
How often or how long does settling usually take?
Settling?
Or you said sometimes it has to sort of.
The first time you go sailing.
Okay.
As soon as you put load on it. Sometimes I just take it and shake the rig really hard, and that helps. But as soon as you put a load on it, sail and tack both, everything should be settled. It doesn't take it's not like it stretches.
And any difference between wire rod not twisted.
Wire stretches more. That's the only. Rod doesn't stretch as much. But other than that, there's not much. I'm assuming it's the exact same as carbon. Wire, Dyneema, it's all the same. Just the amount of stretches changes. Wooden boats like Dolphin may look like they have a modern rig, and it is a modern rig, but the boat's wood. Boat flexes more, so don't tighten it up as much. Cool.
How do you know what your jack pressure should be?
You don't. Far 40, you have a tuning guide. On a brand new boat that you've never sailed before, that nobody's sailed before and it's custom, you don't. Right? You want enough pre-bend that your main sets up nice in the base setting that you want to aim for, which is usually somewhere between 8 and 10 knots of breeze, right? Is your base setting. When you go out sailing and testing it, you want to be sailing in your base setting to test your D2 side to side, right? So if you go, we tune the 540, we want to go sailing in about 8 to 10 knots of breeze to see if it's set up right. But your jack pressure will come out of having all your sails sailing properly. If you go out and you go sailing and you race in your 8 to 10 knots of breeze and it looks really nice, you've got just a little bit of sag at the D1s and D2 spreaders just to leeward, and everything feels good, and your puff control feels good, you come in, you check your jack pressure, and you write that jack pressure down as your base jack pressure. And that becomes your new tuning guide.
Reminder of how you check jack pressure?
You jack it up with your fingers on the shims really slowly when you get near it moving, and right when the shim starts moving, that's your jack off pressure. And then you're going to open the jack really slowly and drop the pressure down till right when the shim stops moving, and that's down pressure. You average the two after doing it a couple of times, and that's your jack pressure. You'll notice that your jack off pressure is higher and your jack down pressure is lower. And so by averaging the two, you get something in the middle. So really quick, I'm going to do straight spreader rigs. Just really quick. Dom will find out more about these ideas. Your straight spreader rigs literally don't do that much. So you got a forestay somewhere around here. You might have a top mast backstay. You've got runners. You might have a check stay. You might have a second check stay. Who knows? So a straight spreader rig, because the spreaders are not swept back, your D1s and your D2s do not affect your mast bend much at all, if at all, right? Which means that all of your mast bend is determined by your backstays and check stays, which means you can very precisely control what your bend is, right? You put on a little runner, and you put on top mast or your runner, which is usually a little higher than the forestay. Am I right, Don? Your runners go just above the forestay? Generally?
Generally, just because generally the mast is so thin there's not enough room to attach them to the same thing.
Yeah. And you might have a top mast, but to adjust your bend, you put it on your backstay, your mast starts bending a ton. There's no D1s and D2s to prevent the mast from bending. So then you tighten up your check stays if you have 2, 3, 4, and depending on how much you pull on each individual check stay, that'll control how far the mast will bend forward in that spot, right? So you put on your runner and you have your check stays kind of preset, and you check that, and then you can very precisely control how flat your main gets in quadrants, right? Your top mast runner will start the process, that will control the top. Your mid check stay will control the top third, your middle check stay will control the middle third, your bottom check stay will control the bottom part of the main. And you can very precisely flatten your main out. And this is why people loved straight spreader rigs for racing, is because they're very tweaky. You can tweak the whole thing. And then because you have so many spreaders, when you look at it side to side, right, you can control your side to side mast bend by adjusting your D2s. And that's all they do, is adjust how much the mast bends, right? And that's the fun part about straight spreader rigs.
What's
is
the
that
disadvantage?
they're way complicated, right? If you go do a jibe and with a spinnaker up and you don't have runner on, you might tear your rig down because you've got no safety net of swept back spreaders, swept back D1s, D2s, and your cap shrouds are all helping to support your rig.
Yeah.
The mast tends to twist a lot too. When your mainsail loads up to one side, the mast will actually twist 10 or 15 degrees. Because your main wants to pull it off to leeward, the back of it to leeward, and the wind of it twists to windward. And then when your puff hits, that does some really weird things as well. Swept back spreader rigs tend to prevent the twisting a little bit.
Right.
And so swept back spreader rigs tend to be more forgiving for changing conditions. They're more dynamically forgiving. When things change, puffs hit, and wind changes, and groove, and all that, but they're less tweaky. So technically, if you had a really, really, really good crew, you could probably go a little faster with this.
Right.
But as most of us know, when you simplify your boat, you tend to sail faster on average. That's a rule of thumb. That's why I went to ASIMs. That's why we did. You know, you don't want a tiny groove. You want a fairly large groove. Even though your top speed's probably a little better, with smaller grooves and more tweaky boats, the easier and more forgiving the boat is, usually the faster on average you sail. And that's just a general rule for sailing. Usually you want to set your boat up to be pretty forgiving, not to be super tweaky with tiny grooves and stuff. Does that make sense?
Yep.
That's a pretty common thing in modern sailing, is making it easy. So, yeah, that's it. Let's go put a rig together.
Awesome.